I want to remind you that 2 weeks from today is when the first reflection essay is due. Remember, you don't have to do them all, so you can drop out one, and that's acceptable. But the first one is due 2 weeks from today.
You get a bonus if you do them all.
You do get a bonus if you do them all. So, what's that?
Oh, the quiz is just the lowest about grades to drop.
The lowest 3 grades get dropped on the quizzes. Right. So that's another thing as well. Keep up with the quizzes. If you haven't, I will allow some grace. So if you haven't completed Tuesday's quiz and today's quiz, you can go back and complete them. But make sure you keep up with those. So reading quizzes pretty much every day except the days that we have an exam. So 2 weeks from today, first reflection paper. If you have any questions, the assignment is on Blackboard, a link to the reading for that. But contact me if you have any questions. If there's any questions now, so we can take questions now. But all right, so we are still in the middle of talking about the category of religion, or talking about religion in a general way. Tuesday, Lord willing, we'll get into discussing Judaism, so actually getting into a discussion of religion. There were a couple things left over from Tuesday. We were talking about the idea of religion connected to ultimate concerns, but let's take a little bit of time and talk about what we did get to. There were a couple things to finish up, but thinking back to Tuesday, now don't look at your notes, don't look at the textbook. What can you remember about what we talked about on Tuesday? Okay, and thinking about concepts of defining religion, what were some of the things that we talked about, or what were some attempts to try and define religion?
In conclusion, that most religions have a higher being of some sort.
Okay, so higher being, a deity, a divine power present in most religions. What else did we? Other kind of things we could talk about on Tuesday. All right, we're talking about. Unfortunately, the Pastafarians won't be on exam. But yeah, we did talk about Pastafarianism and this idea of in modern times of these developing quote unquote religions that are often critiques of standard organized religions, so called. Dana Carvey did a bit a couple years ago in his stand-up act about what a disorganized religion would be like. We meet on Tuesdays, sometimes Thursdays. You can we might sing a couple hymns. You can hum along if you like. We might be at P.F. Chang's, right? It's an organized religion versus disorganized religion. Yeah, that's true. What other kind of things did we talk about? What are some of we talked about some of the components that make up religions, the places for study. What were some of the things that we talked about of what do you study when you study religions? All right, so history, we talked about the relationships with culture, getting into things like even economic situations, gender, class, other things like that.
Important figures.
Right, important figures. What are some of the key figures? What did they do? How did they influence those religions? So with thinking about this category of religion, we got into, at the end, talking about approaches to salvation or liberation. We emphasized, Geertz's Definition of religion, again, PowerPoints are available on Blackboard, so if you didn't get all of that, you can refer back to PowerPoint. But this idea of the symbolic system and the way in which that becomes very powerful in the lives of people, it shapes not only how they feel, how they think, what motivates them to do, but also the importance of those things appearing to be true. We're picking up today in the midst of talking about this, the ways to salvation or liberation. As we noted and as we read in Prothero, the idea being that we're not suggesting all religions are the same or all have the same goals or desires, but essentially religions tend to fall into some categories or themes with this desire of experiencing liberation or salvation or making things right in the world. And so each of these four, the way of faith, devotion, discipline, action, the way of meditation, and insight, we'll spend some time breaking down here a little bit more in detail. First, the way of faith. Now, in a sense, we could argue that faith is a part of all religious traditions, in the sense that they subscribe to beliefs or conceptions that cannot be observed, and so they have a faith. But in the sense that we're talking about this religions that emphasize the way of faith or the path of faith to liberation, we're essentially talking about religions that emphasize the need for trust. And so what we're comparing here is faith in the sense of assent to propositions, right? I believe Jesus is the Son of God is a faith statement, but in the sense we're using it here is this notion of trusting in someone or something. All right? Particularly a lot of the ways of faith are focused on someone, some sort of being or power. Not only is it trust, but religions that evidence this approach also postulate the need for dependence. You're relying on that person or that thing. And often the way of faith is also conjoined with claims that the believer can do nothing to bring about salvation. It is totally based on a person's trust, a reliance, or dependence. A couple of examples of this within Christianity, of course, Protestant Christianity, largely shaped by the thinking and writings of Martin Luther. Luther emphasizing the need to be justified or made right in God's eyes through faith, and justification by faith. That works cannot bring about salvation. Instead, what brings about salvation, what makes us right with God, is trust. But the way of faith is not only a Christian concept. Other religions would fall into this as well. An example of this in a non-Christian religion would be Pure Land Buddhism. Pure Land Buddhism focuses on faith in Amida, the Buddha of infinite light. And the story is that Amida had made a vow, a commitment, to create a pure land for people to be reborn into, that it would make it easier to achieve nirvana. Now, obviously, we'll say more about this when we get to Buddhism. But the key thing to achieving rebirth in the Pure Land was through faith in the Amida Buddha. Right? And so that was how you achieved it. It wasn't through your deeds. It wasn't through accomplishing certain duties. It was through your trust in Amida. Instead of trust, some people, some religions, seek to achieve liberation by devoting themselves fully to God, God's Spirit. While there can be a kind of conjoining of faith and devotion, the focus of the path of devotion is on that experiential component. The key here is not just devoting yourself to God, but devoting yourself to God to achieve that experience. That's what these people are looking for. And so the way of devotion is often deeply connected to emotion and feeling, predominantly love expressed for the deity, but you can also see paths that would emphasize other emotions like fear. Largely also in the way of devotion, there is an antipathy or a rejection of any sort of formalized approach. And often, devotees of a specific tradition within a larger religion would look at other forms as being formulaic. They're dead. They're not useful, right? And so that this is the way to achieve this personal encounter. This personal encounter isn't formulaic. It's not patterned. Many religions have these types of components, usually what's referred to as mysticism. The mystic is not looking for greater knowledge of particular religious truths, but instead they are looking for encounters with God, getting lost in the divine. And so you have Sufism within Islam. You have Bhakti in Hinduism, both of which we'll spend more time talking about when we get to Hinduism and Islam. But often there is, especially these groups that are within a religion, often there's a lot of tension between the mystics and those that aren't following that path. As, for example, in Islam, many other Muslims would say that Sufism is essentially blasphemy. You can't have that kind of relationship with God, is the way most Muslims would look at it. This love, the getting lost in the divine, that's not who God is for most other Muslims. Right? And so while Sufis might look at other forms of Islam as boring, dull, dead, lifeless, you have the opposite of looking at Sufism as heretical, as blasphemous. Other religions, other traditions emphasize the importance of action. There are certain duties or obligations that must be performed, and it is the need of the human being to discipline themselves to engage in these things. Often the path of discipline action shows up in the necessity to engage in certain patterns. And patterns not just in worship services, right, specific times of worship, but in everyday life. That could be the schedule of the day. It could be the religious calendar, right? Certain times during the year, I do these things. Sometimes experience is important, right? The experience of what occurs in these things, but most times it's not. The emphasis is on accomplishing one's duty. So the path of disciplined action is often very common, traditional, and very rarely is there any sort of dramatic occurrence believed to occur. The focus in this path is on orthopraxis, right action. Right? Orthodoxy, right? If something's orthodox, that's related to correct teaching. But the focus isn't so much on the teachings as it is on doing the right things. Rituals have to be done in the appropriate ways. And in most cases, what devotees of this path are looking for is people to conform to behavior in doing this way. Not you're free to do it however you love. As examples of this, people observing the 5 pillars of Islam, engaging in the regular prayers throughout the day, engaging in the giving of 2.5% of your income, of your possessions, Other examples might include the interpretation of the rabbis in Judaism, Orthodox Judaism. There's this disciplined action. Things must be done in the right way. These foods must be prepared in this way. This food is clean, this food is not clean. The focus is on the action. The last path we talked about, or we listed, was the path of meditation and insight. The intellectual component. Often, many of these traditions are very esoteric. The knowledge, the wisdom that they're seeking is obscure, it's hidden, it is not readily available. And so it's through meditation, it's through those times of reflection and study that you achieve this. Now, because of it being esoteric, it's often hard to understand or grasp, meaning that most people that follow the way of meditation and insight are considered to be spiritually elite. It's not for the common people. Essentially, the people that are involved in this kind of path are people who have the luxury of pursuing insight and the time to practice meditation. Those that achieve this insight are considered to be spiritually mature or spiritually advanced. And because of these demands, the esoteric nature of knowledge, the need to have time to practice these things, there are very few people that choose any sort of path of insight. Just briefly, two examples. One would be something like Theravada Buddhism, because Theravada Buddhism emphasizes the need to be a monastic, right, to be a monk or a nun, in order to achieve liberation. And so you have to have the time. You set yourself apart to meditate, to search for insight. Certain types of yoga in Hinduism, which are very much unlike yoga in the West, are focused on you put yourself in certain positions so that you're able to better meditate. What questions do you have? Anything we need to clarify about any of those paths? Again, we'll spend more time on these examples and the specifics as we get into those religions. All right, let's kind of sum it all up, bring all those things together that we were talking about Tuesday in what a lot of scholars have referred to as the dimensions of religion. We're bringing kind of all these things into what are different expressions within religion. In a sense, we might say that looking at religious systems, religions often involve the totality of human existence. It's not just a cognitive approach. It's not just a practice, but instead all of those things are a part of it. And so some scholars, in trying to define religion and religious practice, have emphasized these different dimensions. Religions deal with the cognitive. They focus on what believers should know. Often the cognitive can be presented in stories in many traditions. When you think about the different stories that you find in religious traditions, they are often not just stories, but are meant to demonstrate a point or to communicate a moral.
So a parable?
A parable is a good example of something like that, but the idea is that there are some intellectual things, right? Some cognitive things that have to go on in the brain. Another focus in religion is on the ethical. How should people behave? And often religions have not just personal ethics, but social ethics. How the world should work, or how a community of believers exists in a larger community. There are moral rules, patterns of behavior, examples held up as you should be like this person. And in most cases, religions argue that it shouldn't just be about the rules, but a way of life. because this is a part of the ethical dimensions. A third dimension of religion is the ritual, action. And as we talked about on Tuesday, rituals, the practices of a religion are often highly symbolic. There's not just the action, it represents something else. Things like worship, prayer, meditation. Now, within the ritual component of religions, there may be prescribed ceremonies. You do this thing at this time, and then you follow it with this action and this thing being said. Some others allow for change, innovation, but essentially there is within ritual the belief that the ritual actually accomplishes something. And most of the time, these rituals are connected with the idea of transformation. Something is transformed in the practice of ritual, whether that's the self, whether that's someone else, God, the natural world. Something happens in ritual, and it's not just about, okay, I've done these actions, I've said these words, and that's it. The people who engage in prayer believe that someone is out there listening and will do something about it. The Navajo, in their sand paintings, believed that it would affect the holy people, bringing about healing, striking down one's enemies. There would be some sort of transformation that occurred. Most religions also include an institutional dimension. The longer religions exist, the more organizational structure develops. And in fact, in most cases, without organizational structures, religious views, religious practitioners, religious systems die out. There's nothing to continue it on from generation to generation. Now that can be a strong organization like a denominational board and regional governing boards, or it can be simple as a prophet and her or his followers. Sometimes the organization is specified. These are our leaders. This is how this runs. And then sometimes it's just simply understood. People know how things work. But simply the distinction that is made between religious specialists, right, the priest, the shaman, the minister, the monk, the difference made between that class and the common people is in itself a representation of some sort of institutionalization. Religions also tend to have components dealing with the aesthetic. Notions about what is artistic, what is beautiful. And religions are heavily connected to the senses. Things that can be seen, heard, touched, tasted, smelled. All of this fits into religions. Architecture, art, music, poetry, incense. All of these kind of things shape religious experience. And then finally, the final dimension of religion to emphasize here is the emotion. Religions have those components that are dealing with moods and feelings, hope, fear, love, awe. All of these are part of what it means to be religious. What questions do you have? Any of these dimensions I need to clarify? All right, let's move from talking about the category of religions to begin thinking about the study of religions. What are we engaged in? Especially thinking about this approach that is investigating different religious types. There are a variety of challenges that anyone who would study religion faces. First of all is what has been referred to as the insider-outsider problem. Essentially, the insider-outsider problem refers to the question of who is a better expert or who has more standing to talk about religious experience? Is it the person who is inside the religion? Or is it the person who is outside? Especially in kind of an academic setting. Now, on one hand, we would say, well, insiders know how things work. They can provide us insight on how this thing is done, how it feels, all those kind of aspects that are made up with being religious. But on the other hand, the outsider sometimes can notice things that people don't realize. Other forces that are at work that might be shaping certain behaviors or beliefs. Another tension, especially in the short time that we have here, is which is more important to pay attention to? Is it more important to pay attention to beliefs, or is practice more important? Which came first? Were the practices present and the beliefs came out of it, or were the beliefs there first, then the practices came out of that? Simple example of this would be something like communion. Was it the beliefs or the practice that developed first? Now, in a sense, we'd say, well, Jesus is kind of doing both, right? This is my body, this is my blood, while he's handing bread and wine to the disciples. But in thinking about how it's practiced on the first day of the week, all the things that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians 11, he's kind of condemning the Corinthians for their practice. You're not doing it right. Was there already, did they already have a shared pattern of ideas about the Lord's Supper, or is Paul introducing it to them? Right? So they've been practicing, and now he's telling them this is how you should be doing it. Or is it set out to the Corinthians, you should be doing the beliefs component, and then the practice gets messed up? And then finally, in thinking about religions, should we approach them and experience in a reductionistic way, or should we just spend time on the phenomenology, describing it? Here's what they say happened. Right? Here's how this supposedly feels when doing this ritual. Or do we try to find some sort of explanation? Well, the reason that this person claims to have spoken to God in the Waffle House is because of the bad syrup. Right? Do we look for those reductionistic, right? That it's a symptom of something else. Right? Psychology, sociology, it's family relations, all those kind of things. That's what caused this to happen. Or do we say, let's just describe what they believe, what they practice, and not really try to say this is what this came from. Now, probably what happens with most people who are religious is we want a phenomenology of our own religion while reducing everybody else's. Now, again, I don't say that to say all religions are true or anything like that, but it's just that kind of, we want to explain away Muhammad's experience of the angel Gabriel as being some sort of figment of his own imagination, the experience of being out in the wilderness, but we want to believe Mary actually was visited by Gabriel. Now again, I believe Mary actually was visited by Gabriel. I'm not entirely sure what happened with Muhammad, but I believe that he at least thinks that he encountered him. But in trying to look at other religions, we would be okay with certain reductionistic explanations, but when people try to explain or try to reduce our own religion, that's where, of course, we often find ourselves hesitant to allow those kind of things. And that kind of also gets into some other issues related to the study of religions, and a big question within religious studies is, why do religions exist? Why are there religions? Essentially, there are three major views about why religions exist. These are in no particular order. The first is what's often been referred to as the materialist view. Essentially, the materialist view is human beings invented religion. The materialist tends to believe that the physical world is all that exists. And so, religions must be a product of some sort of human invention. All right? Whether that's a psychological incident, whether that's developed out of sociology, of societies acting together, but essentially the notion that religions were invented. A second view is called the functionalist view. There are religions, say the functionalists, because religions work. They do things. They accomplish things. People have experiences, and they provide something for them. The functionalist isn't as interested in the question of were they invented or did things actually happen. Instead, the functionalist is that's not as important as what it does for the person's life who participates in that religion. The third view would be the belief view. Religions exist because there is something out there that people have tapped into. And so the notion that religions reflect a spiritual, supernatural reality. In general, these are the three major views of religious studies scholars in thinking about religions, obviously reflecting different positions religiously themselves. Most people who would be religious would tend to not be materialists. Right? They would tend to not say religions were invented, although you might find some that would engage in religion because of the communal aspects or the kind of kinship they might get out of it. But in general, most religious people are going to either be here or maybe even functionalists. So, why are there religions? Well, some say they may be invented, some say there's actually something out there. But again, on this origins question, where did they come from? And in thinking about the fact that religions aren't the same, how did they develop? Why do we have some monotheistic groups and other polytheistic groups and some that don't even believe in gods of a sort? Well, where did they come from? The standard anthropological approach is what we might refer to as the evolutionary perspective. Essentially, anthropologists, sociologists, and others in early years of studying religion in this way accepted notions of human origins and evolution and then said, well, if humans evolved, then human systems must have evolved as well, right? Our structures, our civilizations, and religion would be a part of that as well in the evolutionary perspective. And so many anthropologists have postulated that religions have developed through several stages, as societies have developed. The earliest stage in most of this perspective is what's known as the mana stage. Mana is a Melanesian term from the South Pacific, and it refers to a spiritual power that permeates the universe. It is in no way a personal being. It is just a force that exists in the world, in the universe. Now the term mana, again, is Melanesian, but this concept is found in a wide variety of indigenous traditions, whether that's Ashe in the Yoruba, whether that is Wanatu or Wakan among Native Americans. This notion of there is this spiritual power and you try to tap into it. Right? You try to harness it. But the assumption is, from the evolutionary perspective, is that as human beings, Homo sapiens, developed and evolved, they began to get this impression that there was some sort of power to tap into. But eventually, that power began to be, as culture evolved, began to be more personalized in what's often referred to as animism, from the Latin for spirit. Right? So animate, to animate to make something move. So the notion being that eventually ideas developed of spirit beings that inhabited the universe, that inhabited the world. And eventually, again, evolution, right? So you have development. People started developing rituals to either appease these spirits or get them to participate. These could be spirits of animals or even plants, other living things, eventually maybe something like the ancestors. Out of animism developed, according to anthropologists, polytheism. So not, moving beyond these spirit beings to deities, powerful beings inhabiting the universe, but a multitude. Right? So you kind of start with this power, you get into beings, multiple beings here, but multiple gods, polytheistic. And eventually some societies evolved into henotheistic societies. Henotheism involves a plurality of powerful spirit beings or gods, but there is one God who is usually the creator, but is the supreme being, the high God, who probably in most of the stories of these civilizations created the other God, right? So he created the universe and then created the other gods. And all four of these are still around. You can find societies like that. And then eventually the assumption is some societies evolve into monotheism. There is one God. And so essentially what's going on here is anthropologists, sociologists have accepted the notion of human evolution. But in order to explain religion and compare it and complete it with evolution, you have to have this evolutionary development. So gradually, societies became monotheistic in this approach. The alternative, and the one that Corderon lays out, he does talk about the evolutionary perspective, but the one he supports, the one I support, the one that probably most Christians would feel acceptable, is an alternative to the evolutionary perspective that actually works the other way, called original monotheism. The assumption of original monotheism is that there was originally one God. And that one God was worshipped by human beings, but gradually over time, human beings developed other approaches, other systems, henotheism, polytheism, other approaches. So essentially, kind of taking this chart, trying to reproduce it here a little bit, there was original monotheism, which in one sense developed into monotheistic traditions, but through a variety of religious change also developed other approaches as people turn to alternatives to try and encounter or appease or control God. Now, one of the things that Corderon emphasizes that is also problematic about either perspective is that you find in a lot of these other religions notions of an original monotheism. Examples of where we could see an old tradition of monotheism. Holdovers. What do we mean? Well, the kind of things that you can kind of see in monotheisms, you also kind of see in some other traditions. Right? That there is one God, usually described with masculine qualities. And most of the traditions reflect a lot of sociological realities, although in more recent times there's a little bit more fluidity. That God lives separate from the created world. There's something distinct. He's extremely powerful, knowledgeable, created the world. It is God who sets the standards for good and evil. And those human beings that God created exist in a variety of relationships to God, many times alienated from God by disobeying those standards, but God provides a way to be reconciled. Cordovan does list those, and they are on Blackboard, so in case you don't get them all down. What makes it problematic for either of these systems, approaches, is that, of course, people that would support the original monotheism approach tend to be Christians or Jews, perhaps even some Muslims, right? People that believe that. And so they are kind of discounted, as Cordovan points out, because, well, you believe that, and so, we can't trust that you're not being affected by your presuppositions. But on the alternative, the problem with going the evolutionary route is that as people began to study religions, those kind of things were already in place. Meaning that there were evidences of monotheism there because of the encounters with predominantly Christian explorers. So once people started actually studying these groups, there's such a mix and amalgamation. There are no true societies anymore, in the sense of truly mono-societies. You still find that belief, but it's mixed with other beliefs. And so, at the very least, we can't go back and find and point out in any sort of record an evolutionary development. We have to assume, if we accept evolution, that it started from simple and went to complex, because we're assuming evolution is true. But we don't have, in the case of religious development, any sort of records that demonstrate those kind of things, because most indigenous societies didn't write until after they were colonized. Right? They shared things orally. They didn't have written languages, and so there are no texts written down where we could see.
Things that were written down, things tended to degrade with time.
Yeah, so even if there were things written down, the fact that they would have been preserved is very unlikely as well.
Even large simple because it tend to completely decay away.
So it's a very difficult position shaped by presuppositions on both sides. Right? So there's presuppositions on both sides of that debate, with people obviously lining up with where they believe. So religion, the study of religion is a difficult study, but one that can be approached in a variety of ways. And so I want to talk about a couple of approaches and asking, what are the best ways to study religion? Religion is studied in a variety of ways across a variety of departments in the university, from people from different backgrounds and different fields. But some of the ones we're going to focus on here are the major fields of the study of religion. So the first, again, these are not in any particular order. The first is people who study religion from the fields of theology or philosophy. Now, if you're coming as a theologian or a philosopher, what are the kind of things you would be most interested in knowing about religions? What are you going to look at? What are you going to focus your attention on if you're coming from theology or philosophy?
Obviously, they believe about what the deity
Yeah.
theology.
Yeah, your focus is going to be on ideas, right? What are the ideas? How does this idea relate to that idea? How do they transmit ideas? Right? The focus is going to be on the ideological component, the beliefs, the theologies of religion. Another field of study is what we might call ethnography or participant observation, anthropology here as well. If you're approaching religion this way, what are you going to be focused on, or what are you going to do to achieve your study, to find your answers? What would you be most interested in if you were an ethnographer, anthropologist? Right? You're going to want to observe the people, right? And observe them while being there, right? And so the participant observation of going to a worship service or living with a community. Right? The focus is on culture in anthropology and human beings participating in culture. And so the ethnographer watches or talks with people or takes part in different ceremonies or rituals. A third method in the study of religion is psychology. The focus on psychology is, of course, the human mind. How does religion relate to human needs? And so they're going to ask questions about motivations, experience, outcomes. Right? Are religious people more likely to be against alcohol? Are religious communities going to be more prejudiced than non-religious people? These are the kind of things that psychologists would be interested in studying. A fourth method is sociology. The sociologist is focused on social behaviors. How does religion, or how do religious people in a community interact with other people in a community? So, how do religions affect public policy? How are religions affected by public policy? How involved are religions in social causes? What's the economic makeup of a particular religious group? Usually with sociologists, there are a lot of numbers, right? Percentages, there's all sorts of things with statistics. But the focus is on society and social interactions. Those are some of the major ones, but other approaches, other methods could be used as well. Literary criticism. Right? While the literary critic would be kind of interested in ideas, it's more about a focus on text and issues with text. How are texts created? Right? How was this scripture created? How was this document that's important created? How are they transmitted? What context did the text develop in? Has it changed and modified over time? Right? Did it start out this way and gradually other parts were added to it? How does that reflect the views of the group at different times? Art history, art criticism. We could also put in there music, architecture. Focus on those elements, right? What does architecture tell us about this group and what's important? What does the music tell us? How have these things changed over time? Religion has also been studied from a biological component or cognitive science. Cognitive scientists are focused on the physical brain versus the psychologists being concerned about the mind. What goes on in the brain? What parts are active when someone prays, when someone worships? And then finally, the last method would be history. events, how are those events interpreted, what actually occurred versus what was said to have occurred, what kind of influence do different people have on different events. So religion can be studied from a wide variety of approaches and produces different results. A psychological study is going to look different than a historical study. A theological approach is going to look different than a ethnography. Now, hopefully, most scholars and most people that would be interested in studying religion are going to approach it and seek insight from a wide variety of fields, because those that only focus on ideas miss the practice. Those that focus only on the psychology miss the history. So this kind of very interdisciplinary approach. What questions do you have about the methods? Any of these we need to clarify? Let's move on into talking about some terms. Some important terms that will help us as we go through the semester. Having that shared vocabulary that helps us know what we're talking about. And so trying to hit some of the highlights of important terms in the general, the broad. We'll obviously be talking about vocabulary within traditions as well. Belief, of course, is probably something that you don't necessarily need to have defined for you, but when we're talking about beliefs, we're talking about intellectual assent to certain propositions. Religions have propositions. There is one God is a proposition. Belief is assent to that proposition. Now, certain religions, predominantly certain types of Christianity, maintain that being religious revolves around having the right set of beliefs. For other religions, it's not as important. It's more about the practices. Another term used that you'll find in a variety of situations is the term myth. Now, as we're using it, a myth is a symbolic story that provides meaning. Often when we use the term myth in just kind of a common way, we're talking about something that's not true. But essentially what we're talking about is, for many people, the literal truth of a symbolic story is not as important as the meaning that it provides. Now, in some traditions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, for example, the historicity of the symbolic story is very important. Right? It's kind of Jesus actually walked the earth is very important for Christians, not just an invented story about Jesus walking the earth. But the myth, the symbolic story, provides meaning, because just a historical claim that Jesus actually walked the earth is not the important part to Christians. The important part is what Jesus represents and who Jesus is. But those myths, those important stories, provide ways of seeing the world, understanding people around you. What's a ritual? Essentially what we're talking about with ritual is a set of repeated religious practices that express meaning in the world. It's not just the practice, but the practice has meaning. We've already talked about how they're often connected with transformation, but it's also important to see that rituals are routinized practices. They are done routinely. But they have ultimate significance in contrast to a habit. Right? You might have a habit of brushing your teeth immediately after getting up in the morning, but that's not a ritual in the sense that we're using it. Right? We might talk about it being a ritual. My ritual is to brush my teeth after I eat. Well, yes, but in the context of what we're talking about, rituals have ultimate significance. They affect things larger in the world. Scriptures refer to a text or set of texts believed to be both revealing ultimate truths as well as being authoritative. You'll find a wide variety of approaches on the issue of Scripture. Some Scriptures are believed to be divine in the sense that they reflect or almost literally the words of God or God's. Other texts are considered Scripture because they reflect ultimate realities. It wasn't that God dictated this, but it was a true record of the experience. Ethics refers to guidelines on what is considered appropriate behavior and how to act in certain situations. So when we're talking about ethics, that's what we're talking about. Another very important term in the study of religion is the term symbol, which we've already addressed. The idea of this kind of visible representation of an invisible reality or concept. It could also refer to language that is used by people to describe those realities, or to the practices which are believed to interact with those realities. Some scholars of religion would essentially argue that everything about religion is symbolic. And it points to something else. Deities, of course, refer to supernatural beings, but in most cases, deities tend to be conceptualized as benevolent beings in some way. Those that are evil would usually tend to not be deities, but in some traditions you do find evil deities. Often the term God is used in place or as an alternative. Another important term in the study of religion in more modern times is the term agnostic. Essentially, the agnostic believes that it's impossible to know if there is any supernatural existence. There might be, there might not be, but you can't be sure about it. The term agnostic was actually not used until the 19th century. Prior to that point, there had not been a term to describe such people. Agnostic is different than, of course, an atheist. Atheism refers to a position that essentially says there are no deities, there is no supernatural, an entirely naturalistic view of the world. Later on, we'll talk about, is atheism religious? And again, that will kind of bring up some of the things that we've talked about here about how do you classify something as religious or not. Another important concept within religions is that of the cosmogony. The cosmogony refers to a model that sets out how the world works, sets out the meaning of reality. Now, the cosmogony can refer to how the world was created, or it could simply refer to how a specific society was created. But often the cosmogony is intricately connected with how people live their lives, sometimes without people realizing it. Cosmogony is different than cosmology. Cosmology is the study of the origins of the world from like the standpoint of the science, like physics. So there's a difference between cosmology and cosmogony. Cosmogony would be, stories of how the world began. Last term that is important to recognize is the term cult or cultist. Essentially, this is referring to the system of rituals used by a group. So what rituals a religion engage in is their cult. Now, obviously, probably the most way that you've heard cult is discriminatory, derogatory towards certain religions, right? This is a cult. That's not what we're going to mostly use that term for. If we're talking about cult, or if you see Corderon talking about cult, or Prothero especially, it's referring to that religious component. There are certainly other terms that we could add in here, but as far as general terms that are helpful in the kind of comparative approach that we're talking about, these provide us with the beginning vocabulary to talk about and to know what each other is saying. So we've talked about some of the challenges in studying religion. We've talked about different approaches to how to study religion. But how do religions look at outsiders? Is another kind of approach to viewing religion. And Corderon really kind of talks about this, especially in thinking about how do you as a religious person look at other groups, and how does that shape our study of religion as well as our own personal views? Some religious groups tend to be exclusivistic, that theirs is the only true religion and all other religions are false. Now, in some sense, we shouldn't be surprised by that. If you believe you have the truth, then you're going to tend to look at other groups as being wrong. That's kind of contrasted to the inclusive view or the pluralistic view, as Corderon points out, and that's this notion of all religions have some sort of truth to varying degrees, and all should be applauded, lauded. It's great that we're so diverse. Is there some kind of way to approach both in the kind of acceptance of truths of other religions while still claiming, but the one that's truly true? Is that possible? Well, most people today would say such an inclusive approach would be closed-minded and other types of pejorative terms used. But certainly we recognize, especially within Christianity, some very exclusive truths about the approach to God, about the importance of Jesus. But on the other hand, as Corderon does a really good job pointing out, that shouldn't kind of close us off to recognizing that there are truths in other religions, not to say that they're equally valid approaches to God, but to say there are places for cooperation, contact, discussion. So somewhere between inclusivism and exclusivism. A third approach, and the one that we find more and more in the West, is the secularist approach, which doesn't have to be entirely atheistic, but most atheists tend to be secularists in the sense of religion should not be in the public sphere. If you want to be religious, that's fine as long as you do it privately. Religion shouldn't have an impact on public policy, on the government, on how we live our communal lives in a particular nation. But it's very easy for the secular viewpoint to also be kind of exclusivistic. All right? That this is the only way to look at things. So, these terms aren't as concise or distinct as we might expect. The last area I want to talk about today is really kind of highlight, as I've mentioned before, the really useful idea that Prothero presents in the beginnings of his book. God is not one, of course, plays off of a rather pluralistic view of there being a unity within religions. Okay? This notion of God is one. And that God is one is, however he appears, and there is one God and he appears in different ways in different religions. But Prothero points out that there's quite a bit of difference in religion, and that having this view that they're all just different paths up the same mountain misses some key important points. First of all, religions, for Prothero, are meant to address a problem in human experience. There is something wrong. That could be, as we talked about, sin. But it could also be self-sufficiency. It could be illusion, right? Deception. It could be attachment. Right? So it's going to vary between religions, but a good way to kind of boil these down. What is the problem that this particular religious group sees in society, in the universe? And then in turn, what do they offer as a way to solve that problem? What's the solution? What's the path to overturning that? Whether that's salvation, whether that's submission, whether that's meditation, whether that's following the Four Noble Truths. They're each offering a different solution, a way to solve the problem. And that solution is often connected with a specific technique. There is some sort of core practice or practices that are meant to bring about the solution. And then finally, in those traditions, there is an exemplar, a figure who is to be followed. This is the person that provides the technique, the solution. We follow this person. We follow their example. What questions, comments, cries of disbelief? Well, then we'll go ahead and finish there, and on Tuesday we'll pick up with talking about Judaism, getting into Judaism and looking at the different types of Jews in the world.